glad to be here with all of you today. Thank you for caring enough about water that you are here and being involved in the issues. And I appreciate my colleagues who have presented already today. For those of you who are wondering about Representative Snow's willingness to carry a bill that's died for 3 years. So this year, he is starting in the House a bill, half of the bill, which is just the Jensen case, and I'm starting in the Senate with the big ditch case, for those of you who have been following that issue. That's where we are on that. I also need to express appreciation to the organizers of this meeting for changing the schedule. I know I was scheduled to speak this morning, and I appreciated them freeing up their schedule so that I was free to be at the Capitol this morning, and I'm glad to be here with you this afternoon. I'm sorry my schedule didn't work for me to be with you all day. We've heard a lot about Utah being a desert state, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about the federal government, what I would term their lack of help in dealing with our desert concerns. But before I get into the issue, I need to say that anytime we talk water policy, or really any policy, we need to have it based on good principles. So I propose to set the stage for water policy and for a discussion that says that we support the Constitution of the United States, state sovereignty, limited government, and carefully defined and division of powers and between the state, between the federal government. Now, when our founding fathers wrote the Constitution, they gave very specific rules and direction on what were of the federal government, and everything else was left to the states. And then, just in case there was some misunderstanding on what was left to the states for their control, they wrote Amendment 10 in the Bill of Rights, which says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the state respectively, or to the people. So there was a very clear explanation. The federal government has limited rights. The states have all the rest of the rights and control that have not been enumerated. So it's probably clear to you that I am very uncomfortable with the federal overreach that is taking place right now. I'm dealing with a lot of issues. In this case, it'll be water. But I'm very alarmed because I'm reminded that this is not just me being some kind of extremist. Let some of you think I'm just a little wacko on this. We need to remember that this Constitution and these freedoms that we have been given to base our policy discussions on and to govern ourselves on are very sacred opportunities that have been bought with a price. And this is a serious responsibility that has been bequeathed to us by those who have given their last full measure of devotion. We have our time in history now to remember their legacy and to continue to promote the Constitution and those things that were granted to us as our responsibilities and rights. Thomas Jefferson said, when the people fear the government, that's tyranny. But when the government fears the people, that's freedom. I need to say I'm starting to fear the government. I'm almost maybe past that. I'm not supportive of the federal government forgetting that they have limited powers. I'm not supportive of them federalizing education, or federalizing medical care, or federalizing water, or federalizing any of our lives. And it's a very frightening time right now when we realize that there is a real strong overreach by the federal government to come into every part of our lives. I mean, they've started out being irritating and then right down invasive. So as far as that applies to water, let me talk a little bit about water. And I want to give a little more history, with apologies if this is all something you understand. If it's not, I just want to set the stage a little further so you'll understand why I'm so concerned. The Constitution provides, as you know, for the governed, and that would be the federal government in this case, to respond to the people, for the governed, that would be us, to have a voice to those who govern, who is the federal government. In the 1930s, under the New Deal, there was a new, there was established the Federal Reserve, the Federal Registry. Now, the Federal Registry is a very interesting, what I would call a bureaucratic behemoth, because what it does is it suggests rules, it writes edicts, directives, that somehow become law. The Federal Registry can proceed with writing these rules and regulations based on three things: an executive order, suggestions from Congress, or their own ideas on how to proceed. So these rules and regulations in the Federal Registry, I'm going to show them to you. We started under Roosevelt. Basically give the departments that didn't even exist when the Constitution was written, the Department of the Interior and the Forest Service and BLM, all these departments, the right to write these rules. Then they generate these rules and regulations, put them in the Federal Registry, and the public can respond. But for them to become law, all that has to happen is for the president to sign on. So if he's written an executive order, and then these agencies write directives or rules on how to implement his executive order, all he's got to do is sign it into law, unless the Senate and the House both vote to override that, which apparently has happened only once. I put myself in this picture because I wanted you to get the perspective. I am standing next to two over 6 foot tall stacks of books of rules and regulations that were generated by the Federal Registry last year, just last year. Now they're all open for public comment, but even the most dedicated of citizens, of which many of you are, who has time or ability to read through and understand and make comment on this many? In my hand, in the picture, is a stack of laws that were put in place by Congress. Who has to answer to us? We know who they are. They have to respond to us. They come back to us. But in the stacks are the Federal Registry rules and regulations that were generated by the agencies, the bureaucratic agencies. We don't even know who those people are. For most of us, they're faceless bureaucrats that were put into place already, or are in the process of being put into place. I need to say by explanation that this visual I borrowed from Senator Lee. He has those two stacks in his Senate office. And he is proposing a law, and I'm grateful that he's generating support among his colleagues. He is proposing a law that says those rules and regulations generated by the Federal Registry are not law unless Congress opts into them. Right now, the way it is they have to opt out of them. So he has done it a little bit differently. So in that Federal Registry, that brings us to our topic today. In that Federal Registry, that big two huge stacks, there is some regulation there by the U.S. Forest Service that basically says that the U.S. Forest Service is going to have control of all the waters that originate on, pass through, or are adjacent to federally controlled lands. Now, that in Utah would be everything. From the presentation that was just given by Representative Irie, and he passed out that map that you see there on the left, you see the red marks all the land that is controlled by the federal government, and in the west. And this groundwater proposal that we're talking about from the U.S. Forest Service is directed to the west. So that would cover all that red land on the one map, and then all those waters over on the other map on the other side. When the U.S. Forest Service was created, the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, named Gifford Pinchot, said, "The creation of the National Forest Service has no effect on the laws which govern the appropriation of water. This matter is governed entirely by the state and territorial law." It was one of those little small expansions of government in 1907 that seemed so benign and innocuous, and it was just the beginning of huge overreach, because now, as we study what's happening with this groundwater proposal that has come forward from the U.S. Forest Service, they have made some subtle reference to the fact that they need to control all the water in the state in case of, for forest health. We heard a little bit about that in the previous presentation on what's happening with our forests and how unhealthy they are from Representative Ivory. But what's frightening is that this new registration ignores not only tradition, but several other kinds of laws. It ignores the Deseret Land Act in 1877, which said surplus water is free for appropriation. It ignores the Taylor Grazing Act, which says that they shall not diminish possession. It ignores the McCarran Amendment, which waives sovereignty and immunity, which means that the federal government has to follow all the laws dealing with water that the citizens of the state do, because the water belongs to the state, and there have been numerous laws, statutes, and traditions that leave the control of the water to the states. This is very alarming to think that the federal government has put into place this groundwater proposal that says that the Forest Service will control all the water in the state of Utah that originates, passes through, or is adjacent to, which is not clearly defined, adjacent to federally owned lands. So the forest system lands, right now, 14% of the United States water supply and 50% of western United States water supply is controlled by them. You see over there on the west, we're in that group that gets special attention from the federal government. The east, there's where a lot of the laws are made, where a lot of the voting people are taking votes on our western states. Their states do not have a lot of control by the federal government, but we seriously suffer from that kind of a problem. All of this is based on the fact that President Obama issued Executive Order 13514. When he passed this executive order, it basically said that by the year 2020, that we were to have a reduction in drinking water, ag and industrial water by 20% and drinking water by 25% by the year 2020. That was an executive order that was issued, and so the U.S. Forest Service, under the Federal Registry Plan of Issuing Rules and Regulations, just automatically said, oh, well, in order for us to do that, we're going to help the states do it. We are going to control all the land and all the water. I am the co-chair, the Senate chair of the Water Development Commission. My House chair is Representative Keith Grover. Our Water Development Commission has met several times, and I'm sorry you're not going to be able to see this, but basically what it shows is the membership of the Water Development Commission, which includes about 13 legislators and 15 members of the water community, which includes members of the governor's cabinet, people involved with the water districts, people involved with organized environmental groups. We meet regularly and have serious discussions on what's going to happen with the water laws, and we talk proposed law. But earlier this year, in July of last year, we met for several hours and we discussed in detail the proposed groundwater plan from the U.S. Forest Service. We had a detailed discussion, and as a group, we voted to send a letter to the Forest Service expressing our concern. We had bilateral support, we had support of both houses, we had support of everybody on the committee to please ask the Forest Service, or demand that the Forest Service follow the law, because every part of implementation of that law will affect agriculture, will affect economy, will affect recreation, will affect energy development. There isn't any part of that law, any part of our Utah life that won't be affected by the implementation of that law. By writing that letter as a group, I hope it has a little more impact than us as individuals writing, because even though I would like to think our voices matter, when you think back about those 2 7-foot stacks of Federal Registry booklets, it's very hard for a single citizen, unfortunately, to have their voice heard. When we wrote our letter, we joined with a couple other groups who had already written letters. One of them was the Western Congressional Caucus. It's very encouraging to know that the Western Congressional Caucus, as a group, which was also a bipartisan effort, have written letters requesting that the Forest Service not involve themselves in water issues in the West. Also, the U.S. Farm Bureau had written a letter to the Forest Service. There have been other groups that have since then have done this, but Farm Bureau got particularly involved. They're very concerned that it federalizes state water rights. The agency directing is not supposed to be doing rulemaking, that the directive exceeds congressional and Supreme Court rulings, that it overlays federal regulation. But one of the most serious parts about this whole thing, besides the fact that the federal government owns and controls such a huge part of our state, this would end up giving them power almost over the entire state, and it really attacks private property rights, which is one of the pillars of capitalism. It's a very serious threat to us. There has been such pushback against the Forest Service's effort to control water by so many groups that they've backed off a little, but there has been a consideration that the EPA under the Clean Water Act will try to enforce the proposed groundwater amendments under the navigable waters, and I know you're all well aware of that. This president of American Farm Bureau, I'm quoting him because that group is prepared to sue the federal government if they proceed to enforce this proposed groundwater management plan from the Forest Service. And he says this is an attempt by the federal government to take away the rights of property owners to determine what they will do with their own land. So what do we do about all this? This is kind of a frightening thing. Now that I've given you all this little cheery news, we have to think, well, what hope is there? What can we look forward to? The fact that there are a number of groups who have united their voices is very helpful in my mind in doing the pushback against the federal government. But I would encourage any organization of which you are a part to write as an organization and have united voices and talk about the numbers of people you represent, or the amount of water you represent, or the amount of involvement that you have in pushing back against this federal overreach, so that we can maintain control of our waters. All the presentations that we've had today, which have been very valuable, and all the proposed legislation we're talking about on the state level, are really of no significance and have no value if the federal government is going to end up taking control of all of this. There's Representative Tipton from Colorado, who I am very encouraged, has written a bill called the Groundwater Protection Act that he hopes to introduce in this next session of Congress to prevent the federal government from taking control of all those waters. I love Thomas Jefferson, obviously. I've got another quote from him I want to share with you. The chains of the Constitution should bind the mischief of the federal government. I certainly call this mischief if they're trying to take all of our waters. Only when government is limited, our rights protected, the rule of law honored, and freedom allowed to flourish. So I go back to my original Thomas Jefferson quote that says, when the people fear the government, that's tyranny. And when the government fears the people, that's freedom. And I hope that we're all fearful enough that we will do all that we can as individuals and as groups and as a state and as involved in whatever groups we can be part of to unite our voices in maintaining our freedom. And that is one of the big issues that I am working on, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to present it to you today.